When little Natalie grabbed the arm of a Hell's Angel at dawn, crying that her mother never came home, he thought maybe mom went out partying. But when he walked her back to room 127, the door was wide open. Inside, he found something that made his blood run cold, and it wasn't what anyone expected. Within hours, this lone biker would mobilize a force that law enforcement couldn't ignore. This is the story of what happens when evil picks the wrong child to victimize. Before we go further, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Because this story, it could happen in any town, any highway, anywhere. Hit that subscribe button if you believe children deserve protection. What happens next shows exactly why communities need people who won't look away. The sun hadn't fully broken over the Nevada desert when Vince Holloway felt the weight of 52 years settle into his bones. He'd been a Hell's Angel for 23 of those years. Long enough to know that some mornings carry a heaviness you can't explain. This was one of them. He stood in the parking lot of the Sunset Rest Stop, a roadside motel that had seen better decades, strapping down the last of his gear onto his Harley. Highway 40 stretched out before him like a promise of solitude. And that's exactly what he wanted. Just him, the road, and 300 miles to his brother's place in Carson City. No complications, no drama. Just the rumble of his engine and the kind of peace that only comes from leaving everything behind for a while. The motel behind him was the kind of place people pass through, not the kind they remember. Peeling paint, flickering neon sign missing half its letters. The type of establishment where the clerk doesn't ask questions and the guests don't offer answers. Transient traffic, mostly truckers catching a few hours of sleep before the next haul. Vince had stopped there because it was cheap and convenient, nothing more. He tightened the last strap on his saddlebag, his scarred and calloused hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd been doing this ritual for decades. Mechanic by trade, biker by choice. Those hands had rebuilt engines, thrown punches when necessary, and shaken hands with brothers who'd become family. They were working man's hands, and they told a story of a life lived on his own terms. That's when he heard it. Running footsteps, fast and urgent, slapping against the cold asphalt. Vince looked up, and his heart stopped. A little girl was running toward him. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, her small frame wrapped in thin pink pajamas that offered no protection against the desert morning chill. Her feet were bare, and he could see they were already dirty and scraped from the rough pavement. But it was her face that hit him like a freight train. Red and swollen from crying, her eyes wide with terror and desperation. She ran straight to him, not slowing down, not hesitating, as if he were the only lifeline in a drowning world. When she reached him, she grabbed his leather jacket with small, trembling hands. Her voice came out broken and breathless, each word a stab of pure panic. "Please, mister. Please. Mommy didn't come home last night." Vince felt something shift inside him. That protective instinct that every decent person carries, the one that makes you step up when a child needs help. He knelt down slowly, bringing himself to her eye level, and for the first time in years, felt genuinely afraid of what he might be about to discover. Before we go further, if you believe children deserve protection, hit that subscribe button. Because what happens next shows exactly why communities need people who won't look away. The trolls won't like this story. Stand with us. Vince kept his voice steady, gentle. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Natalie," she whispered, still clutching his jacket like it was the only solid thing left in her world. "Okay, Natalie. I'm Vince. Can you show me where your room is? Where's your mommy supposed to be?" She nodded, her small hand slipping into his as naturally as if she'd known him her whole life. They walked together across the parking lot, her bare feet making soft padding sounds against the asphalt while his boots echoed with heavy authority. The morning air was cold enough that he could see her breath, and he noticed her shivering. He shrugged off his leather vest and draped it over her thin shoulders. It swallowed her entire frame, but at least it was warm. As they walked, Natalie's words came tumbling out in fragmented bursts, the way a child's story does when fear and confusion tangle together. "Mommy said wait in the room. She went with the man. She said she'd be back. She promised she'd be back soon." Her voice cracked on that last word, and Vince felt his jaw tighten. "What man, honey? Do you know who he was?" She shook her head. "He was wearing a nice suit. Mommy seemed scared of him, but she said it was okay. She said it was just one more time, and then we could leave." One more time. Those words hung in the air like a threat. They reached the second floor of the motel, walking along the exterior corridor with its rusted railing and doors that had seen decades of desperate stories. Natalie stopped in front of room 127. The door was ajar, not fully open but not closed either, as if someone had left in a hurry and didn't care about what they left behind. Vince felt his instincts flare. Something was very wrong here. He gently moved Natalie behind him and pushed the door open wider. The morning sunlight spilled into the room, illuminating a scene that made his blood run cold. The place had been torn apart, not ransacked like a robbery, but disrupted in the violent, chaotic way that only comes from struggle. A bedside lamp lay shattered on the floor, its shade crushed and bent. The bedsheets had been ripped halfway off the mattress, trailing onto the stained carpet like they'd been grabbed in desperation. A woman's purse, cheap pleather, well-worn, had been dumped out near the door, its contents scattered, a wallet with maybe $20 inside, loose change, lipstick, a grocery store receipt. But no phone, no keys, no woman. Vince stepped inside carefully, every sense on high alert. Natalie stayed in the doorway, and he was grateful she couldn't see everything he was seeing. The overturned chair, the indentation in the drywall where something, or someone, had hit hard. The faint smell of cheap perfume mixed with fierce sweat. "How long ago did your mommy leave, Natalie?" Her small voice came from behind him. "Last night, after dinner. She made me macaroni and cheese from the microwave." Then the man knocked on the door. Vince checked his watch. 6:53 in the morning. If dinner was around 7 or 8 the previous evening, that meant this little girl had been alone in this room for nearly 11 hours. 11 hours. His hands curled into fists. He moved toward the bathroom, and that's where he found it. The mother's cell phone, or what was left of it. The screen was completely shattered, spiderwebbed into 1,000 fragments. It lay on the grimy bathroom tile like a broken promise. Someone had either smashed it deliberately or it had been thrown with tremendous force. Vince picked it up carefully, trying to power it on. Miraculously, it flickered to life, the damaged screen barely readable but functional enough to show the lock screen. He swiped, and by sheer luck, or maybe the mother's panic, it wasn't password protected. The text messages loaded slowly. Most were from someone listed simply as D in the contacts. Vince scrolled through them, and with each message, the picture became clearer and darker. "One more job, and you're clear. Don't make this difficult, Crystal. You know what happens if you run. Be ready at 8. Black Mercedes. Don't keep me waiting." The last message had been sent at 7:42 the previous evening, 18 minutes before Crystal had apparently left with the man in the nice suit. Now, you need to understand something about these highway motels. They're designed to be invisible. People check in, check out. Nobody asks questions. It's exactly why predators choose them. These places exist in the margins of society, where vulnerable people end up when they're running from something or running toward a dream that hasn't worked out. Where a single mother with a young daughter can disappear and nobody notices for days. Where accountability goes to die. Vince looked at those messages again, his mind working through the implications. Crystal. That was the mother's name. And D, whoever D was, had her trapped in something she couldn't escape. Remember those texts from D? Hold that thought, because in about 10 minutes, you'll understand exactly who D is and why Natalie's mother never stood a chance. Vince pulled out his own phone and dialed 911, keeping his voice calm and measured despite the rage building in his chest. He stepped back into the doorway where Natalie could see him, giving her what he hoped was a reassuring nod while the line connected. 911, what's your emergency? I'm at the Sunset Rest stop on Highway 40, room 127. I've got a 7-year-old girl whose mother has been missing since last night. There are signs of a struggle in the room. This needs immediate attention. The dispatcher took his information, asked the standard questions, and told him officers were en route. Estimated time, 20 minutes. Vince thanked her and hung up, then knelt down beside Natalie again. The police are coming, okay? They're going to help us find your mom. But I need you to stay right here for just a minute while I go talk to the person at the front desk. Can you do that for me? She nodded, though her eyes were still wide with fear. He hated leaving her even for a moment, but he needed answers, and he needed them now. The motel office was a cramped, dingy space that reeked of stale cigarettes and instant coffee. Behind the scratched plexiglass partition sat a man who looked like he'd been awake for 72 hours straight. Gaunt face, bloodshot eyes, The kind of exhaustion that comes from working the night shift at a place where nothing good ever happens after dark. Help you? The clerk asked without looking up from his phone. Room 127. Woman named Crystal. You know her. That got his attention. The clerk's eyes flicked up, suddenly cautious. Why you asking? Because her daughter's been alone in that room for 11 hours and her mother's missing. Now, you can talk to me, or you can talk to the cops who'll be here in 15 minutes. The clerk set down his phone. Crystal. Yeah. Checked in 3 days ago. Paid cash. Seemed nervous. Kept looking over her shoulder like someone was following her. Was someone following her? The clerk hesitated, then nodded slowly. There was a guy. Came by twice. First time was the day after she checked in. Second time was last night. Fancy car, fancy suit. Black Mercedes, tinted windows. Didn't match this place at all. I remember thinking he looked like money, and money doesn't usually stop here unless it's looking for something specific. Vince felt pieces clicking together in his mind, forming a picture he didn't want to see but couldn't ignore. Did you see her leave with him? Saw them talking in the parking lot around 8. She looked upset. Then they got in his car and drove off. I figured it was her business, not mine. Nobody asks questions. That's the code of places like this. Vince left the office and returned to room 127, where Natalie was sitting on the bed exactly where he'd left her, still wrapped in his vest. He started searching more carefully now, looking for anything that might explain Crystal's situation. And then he found it. Tucked under a pile of worn clothes in a plastic shopping bag, a receipt from Greyhound bus lines. Departure, tomorrow morning, 6:15 a.m. Destination, Portland, Oregon. Passenger, Crystal Vega. One adult, one child. Total cost, $347. The date on the receipt was today. Vince felt his heart break a little. Crystal had been so close. One more night. Just one more night, and she and Natalie would have been on that bus, heading toward safety, toward her sister's house, toward a new start. She'd scraped together every penny she had for those tickets. $347. Every penny. But someone knew she was planning to run. Someone who couldn't let that happen. And that someone made sure she never reached that bus. The squad car pulled into the Sunset Rest Stop parking lot 23 minutes later, and Vince felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, the system would actually work this time. 2 officers stepped out. One in his mid-40s with a gut that spoke of too many hours behind a desk, the other younger, barely 30, with the kind of cocky stride that comes from not yet having seen enough to be humbled by this job. Vince met them outside room 127, Natalie still clutching his hand. He explained the situation quickly and clearly. The missing mother, the signs of struggle, the threatening text messages, the 11 hours this child had been alone. The older officer, whose nameplate read Kowalski, glanced into the room with all the enthusiasm of someone filling out paperwork for a fender bender. He pulled out a small notepad, clicked his pen, and sighed. Probably just a domestic situation. She'll turn up. Vince felt his jaw clench. A child was abandoned for 11 hours. There are signs of a struggle in that room. Her mother's phone was smashed. There are threatening text messages from someone demanding she do one more job. This isn't a domestic situation. This is something worse. The younger officer, Hayes, smirked slightly. Look, man, we appreciate the concern. But women take off all the time. Could be she got tired of playing mom for a while. Could be she went partying. Could be a lot of things. Did you not hear what I just said? Look at the room. Look at this little girl. Kowalski held up a hand, his voice taking on that patronizing tone that authority figures use when they've already decided you're wasting their time. We'll file a missing person report. Standard procedure. But it needs to be 24 hours before we can really do anything. That's department policy. 24 hours? Are you serious right now? Could be she just took off. Happens all the time. People get overwhelmed, they run. She's an adult. She can come and go as she pleases. Vince felt his blood pressure rising, that old familiar anger that came from watching people in power choose convenience over doing what's right. What about the text messages? What about the man in the Mercedes who was pressuring her? Hayes shrugged. You got a name? A license plate? Without that, there's not much we can do. We'll put the information in the report. The bureaucratic runaround was suffocating. Forms to fill out. Protocols to follow. Check boxes and case numbers and excuses wrapped in policy language. Meanwhile, a woman was missing and her daughter was standing right there, terrified and alone. Kowalski made a call to Child Protective Services, explained the situation in the blandest possible terms, then hung up and turned to Vince. Someone from CPS will be here in a few hours to pick up the girl. We'll make sure she's taken care of. A few hours? Vince's voice was tight, with barely controlled fury. You're going to make her wait here for hours? It's procedure. We can't just leave her with a stranger. The irony wasn't lost on Vince. They were perfectly willing to make a traumatized 7-year-old wait alone in a crime scene for hours, but God forbid she stay with someone who actually gave a damn about her safety. The officers took a few photos of the room with their phones, made some notes, and within 15 minutes they were back in their patrol car, driving away like they'd just handled a noise complaint. Vince stood there watching them leave, feeling that crystallizing moment when you realize the system isn't going to save anyone. That if something is going to get done, you're going to have to do it yourself. He looked down at Natalie, this brave little girl who'd done everything right. She'd asked for help. She'd trusted a stranger when she had no other choice. She'd held on when everything in her world was falling apart. And the people whose job it was to protect her had just shrugged and walked away. Vince made a decision right there. He wasn't leaving this little girl. Not until her mother was found. Not until he knew she was safe. He knelt down beside Natalie one more time. And that's when she leaned in close and whispered something that made his blood turn to ice. The bad man said, if Mommy tells, we both disappear. Right here is where most people would walk away. Let the system handle it. But if you're the kind of person who believes sometimes you have to stand up when others won't, drop a comment saying I stand for justice. Because Vince is about to show you what that really means. What Vince didn't know yet, couldn't have known in that moment, was that those cops weren't just lazy. They weren't just indifferent. One of them had already sent a text message the moment he ran Crystal's name through the system. A text to a number that would make your skin crawl. Because in this story, the rot went deeper than anyone imagined. Vince walked Natalie over to the small diner attached to the motel. One of those places with cracked vinyl booths and a menu that hadn't changed since 1987. He ordered her pancakes and orange juice, watching as she ate slowly, mechanically, like her body remembered it needed food, even though her mind was somewhere else entirely. While she ate, Vince stepped outside and made a phone call. The number he dialed belonged to Bull McKenzie, president of his chapter, a man who'd been riding longer than Vince and commanded respect not through fear, but through absolute, unwavering loyalty to his brothers. Bull answered on the second ring. Vince, you were supposed to be at your brother's by now. Change of plans. Vince kept his voice low but urgent. He explained everything. Natalie, Crystal, the motel room, the text messages, the cops who didn't give a damn. He laid it all out in 2 minutes flat, and when he finished, there was a moment of silence on the other end. Then Bull's voice came through, hard as steel and twice as sharp. We're coming. Nobody touches kids on our watch. Give me 20 minutes to make some calls. The line went dead. What happened next was something most people never see, never understand about the Brotherhood. Within minutes, Bull activated the phone tree, a network of calls that spread through the chapter like wildfire. Brothers called brothers. Plans were dropped. Shifts were abandoned. Tools were set down. Engines roared to life. A welder in Henderson got the call and left his shop mid-job, his partner covering for him without asking questions. A construction foreman in Boulder City told his crew he had a family emergency and was on his bike within 10 minutes. A mechanic, a security guard, a truck driver, a bartender, 17 men total, scattered across Nevada, all receiving the same message. A child needs us. A mother's missing. We ride now. Because that's what brotherhood means. It's not about the leather or the patches or the reputation. It's about the promise that when one of your own calls, when someone defenseless needs protection, you drop everything and you show up. Back in the diner, Vince returned to the booth where Natalie was pushing pancake pieces around her plate. He sat down across from her, and in the gentle way you talk to frightened children, he asked her to tell him about her mom. And slowly, in fragments and pauses, the story came out. Mommy was scared of the phone man. He kept calling. Natalie's voice was small, but there was something almost relieved about finally being able to tell someone. She would cry after he called. She said we needed money. She said she was trying to make it better. Vince listened, his heart breaking with every word. Crystal had been working at a massage parlor in Reno. That's where she met Dee. He'd come in as a customer, well-dressed, charming, the kind of man who knew exactly how to spot vulnerability and exploit it. He'd told Crystal he could get her better work, legitimate work where she'd make real money. Enough to get her and Natalie out of the week-to-week poverty they'd been drowning in. Enough for a fresh start. It was a trap from the beginning. The legitimate work never materialized. Instead, Dee had pulled Crystal into something darker, something she couldn't escape from. He had leverage, debts she supposedly owed, threats about what would happen if she didn't cooperate, promises that after just one more job, just one more, she'd be free. But freedom never came. It never does with men like Dee. She was trying to get us away, Natalie whispered. She said we were going to Aunt Linda's house. In Portland. She said we'd be safe there. $347. One bus ticket. One chance. And someone made sure she never took it. Remember that fancy car the clerk mentioned? The black Mercedes with the tinted windows? Bull knew exactly what kind of operation drives cars like that. Because 3 years ago, his own niece had almost gotten caught in the same trap. She'd been working at a casino bar when a man in an expensive suit started offering her opportunities that sounded too good to be true. Bull had stepped in before it went too far, but he'd learned enough to recognize the pattern. The predators who hunted vulnerable women. The networks that operated in plain sight. The system that protected them. And now, 17 Hells Angels were converging on the Sunset Rest Stop, ready to do what the police wouldn't. The sound came first. That deep, unmistakable rumble of 17 Harley-Davidson engines, a thunder that rolled across the desert highway and into the Sunset Rest Stop parking lot like an approaching storm. Vince looked up from the diner booth and felt something he hadn't felt in hours: hope. They arrived in formation, a rolling wall of chrome and leather that commanded attention and respect. The bikes circled once through the parking lot before pulling into neat rows, engines cutting off in synchronized silence that was somehow even more powerful than the roar that preceded it. Motel guests emerged from their rooms, peeking through curtains, standing in doorways. Some looked intimidated, others curious, all of them uncertain about what was unfolding in front of them. 17 men, most covered in tattoos and road dust, wearing the patches that identified them as Hells Angels. In any other context, people might have been afraid. But there was something different about the energy these men brought. Something purposeful and righteous. Bull dismounted first, a mountain of a man at 6'4" with a gray beard that reached mid-chest and eyes that had seen too much to be fooled by anyone. He walked straight to Vince, and the two men embraced, that hard, back-slapping hug that brothers share when words aren't enough. "Where's the girl?" Bull asked. Vince gestured toward the diner, and Bull followed him inside. The other 16 men stayed in the parking lot, a protective perimeter that sent a clear message. Whatever was happening here, it was under their watch now. Natalie looked up as Bull approached the booth, and Vince watched her eyes widen. Bull was an intimidating figure by any measure. His size, his scars, the patches that covered his vest. But then something remarkable happened. Bull knelt down beside the booth, lowering himself to her eye level, and his entire demeanor shifted. The hardness melted away, replaced by something gentle and grandfatherly. "Hey there, sweetheart. My name's Bull. I know that's a funny name, but it's what my friends call me." His voice was soft, almost tender. "Vince here is my brother. And that means your family now, too. We're going to find your mama. I promise you." Natalie studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Something in Bull's eyes told her she could trust him, and children have an instinct about these things that adults often lose. Outside, the Brotherhood moved with military precision. Bull had already briefed everyone on the ride over, and now they organized into 3 teams without needing further instruction. Team 1, 6 men led by a brother named Razor, would canvass every local business within a 5-mile radius. Gas stations, convenience stores, diners, anywhere with security cameras or employees who might have seen something. They had a photo of Crystal from her driver's license that Vince had found in her wallet. They'd show it to everyone, ask the right questions, follow any lead no matter how small. Team 2, 5 men including Truck and Mongo, would ride to Reno, to the massage parlor where Crystal had worked. They'd talk to the owner, the other employees, anyone who knew her or knew about Dee. They'd apply the kind of pressure that makes people suddenly remember details they claim to have forgotten. Team 3, 4 men led by a tech-savvy brother called Tiny, who was ironically the biggest of them all, would trace the black Mercedes. They'd check every security camera at every business along this stretch of highway. Traffic cameras at intersections, ATM cameras, They'd find that car if it took all day. And Vince would stay with Natalie, now with two other members, Ghost and Preacher, as backup, because that little girl wasn't going to be alone again. Not for 1 second. Here's what most people don't know. Highway corridors are the veins of human trafficking in America. Truck stops, roadside motels, they're carefully chosen. Transient populations, cash transactions, minimal surveillance. The FBI estimates thousands of victims pass through locations exactly like this every year. Women like Crystal, desperate for money, vulnerable, isolated. They're promised legitimate work, better opportunities, a way out of poverty. And then they disappear into a system that treats human beings as commodities. These motels exist in a gray zone where oversight is minimal and questions are discouraged. Where a woman can be taken in the middle of the night and nobody reports it until it's too late. Where a 7-year-old girl can be left alone for 11 hours and the authorities shrug it off as not their problem. But now, 17 Hells Angels were making it their problem. And when brothers ride with purpose, when they're protecting someone who can't protect themselves, they become an unstoppable force. The teams rolled out, engines firing up once more, splitting in 3 directions. The hunt had begun. Team 1 hit their first break at a truck stop 3 miles down Highway 40. Razor and his crew had been showing Crystal's photo to anyone who'd look at it. Cashiers, waitresses, mechanics, truckers filling up their rigs. Most people shook their heads, apologetic but unhelpful. But then they found him. His name was Eddie Vaughn, a long-haul driver from Oklahoma who'd stopped for diesel and coffee around 8:30 the previous evening. When Razor showed him the photo, Eddie's face changed immediately. Yeah, I saw her. Last night. His voice carried that distinctive mixture of concern and regret that comes from witnessing something wrong but not knowing what to do about it. She was in the parking lot right over there. With a man. Razor leaned in. What kind of man? Fancy suit. Out of place for around here. Dark hair, maybe mid-40s. He wasn't treating her right. I could tell from 50 feet away something was off. She looked distressed, like she was trying to get away but couldn't. He had his hand on her arm, real tight. Controlling. What happened? Eddie's jaw tightened. He forced her into a black Mercedes SUV. Not rough enough that I felt like I should call the cops, but not gentle either. She wasn't fighting him, but she wasn't going willingly. I've been driving these roads for 20 years. You learn to read body language. That woman was scared. Did you get a plate number? Partial. I've got a habit of noting plates when something feels wrong. Starts with 7KJ. That's all I caught before they pulled out. 7KJ. It wasn't much, but it was something. Razor called Bull immediately, relayed the information, and the pieces started falling into place. Meanwhile, 60 miles away in Reno, Team 2 had found the massage parlor where Crystal had worked. It was tucked into a strip mall between a payday loan place and a liquor store, the kind of establishment that operates in a legal gray area. The sign out front read, Tranquility Spa, but there was nothing tranquil about the energy inside. The owner was a thin, nervous man in his 50s named Kenny who became visibly anxious the moment 5 Hells Angels walked through his door. Bull did the talking, keeping his voice calm, but leaving no room for evasion. We're looking for information about one of your employees. Crystal Vega. Kenny's hands trembled slightly as he pretended to check a scheduling book. She doesn't work here anymore. Left about 2 weeks ago. We know. We want to know about a man named D. Someone who came around, talked to her, made her promises. The color drained from Kenny's face so fast, it was like watching a switch flip. His eyes darted to the door, then back to Bull, calculating whether these men were more dangerous than the alternative. I don't know what you're talking about. Bull leaned forward, his massive frame casting a shadow across the desk. Let me be clear. A woman is missing. Her 7-year-old daughter is sitting in a motel right now wondering if her mother is alive or dead. Now, you can help us, or you can explain to those cops who are going to show up after we leave why you refuse to cooperate in a missing person case. Your choice. Kenny's resolve crumbled. When you're already living on the edge of legal, the last thing you want is more attention from law enforcement. He swallowed hard. That's Dalton Reeves. You don't want to mess with him. Tell me about Dalton Reeves. The story that poured out was worse than any of them had imagined. Dalton ran what he called an escort service, but everyone in certain circles knew what it really was, a trafficking operation that preyed on vulnerable women. He'd come into the massage parlor about 3 months ago, smooth and charming, handing out business cards and making promises. Better money, legitimate opportunities, protection. Crystal had been struggling financially, desperately trying to provide for Natalie. Dalton had identified her as the perfect target, isolated, broke, motivated by maternal love. He'd promised her administrative work, scheduling, and client management. Nothing illegal, nothing she'd have to be ashamed of. It was a lie, of course. They always start with lies. Several girls have gone to work for him, Kenny said quietly, his voice hollow. None of them come back. I tried to warn Crystal. I told her to stay away. But she needed the money, and he was good at making it sound legitimate. Bull's jaw clenched. Where does he operate from? I don't know. I swear I don't know. He's careful. Never tells anyone where he actually runs things from. Just gives girls a number to call. You're holding something back. Kenny looked like he might be sick. He has connections. Police, judges, people in power. That's what I've heard. He's untouchable. Girls who try to leave or threaten to talk, they disappear. And nobody investigates too hard because he's protected. Protected by who? I don't know names. I just know that he's never been arrested, never been charged with anything, despite everyone knowing what he does. That tells you something, doesn't it? It told them everything. Bull thanked Kenny, who looked relieved to see them leave, and immediately called Vince with an update. The pieces were coming together now, forming a picture that was both clearer and more disturbing than any of them had anticipated. Dalton Reeves, a trafficker with protection, a predator who'd been operating with impunity because he had people in the system covering for him. Untouchable. That word made Bull smile, though there was no humor in it. Because he knew something that Dalton Reeves was about to learn the hard way. You can't buy protection from everyone. If you can't stand predators who think they're above the law, comment, no more silence. Every comment tells YouTube this matters. The algorithm rewards us, and stories like this reach more people who need to hear the truth. The Brotherhood was closing in, and men like Dalton, who'd grown comfortable in their power, never see the reckoning coming until it's too late. Team 3 had been hunting digital breadcrumbs for hours, and Tiny, despite his nickname, moved through technology with the precision of a surgeon. He and his crew had visited 4 gas stations, 2 convenience stores, a bank, and a fast food restaurant, all within a 10-mile radius of the Sunset Rest stop. At each location, they'd politely but firmly requested access to security footage from the previous evening. Most managers were cooperative once they understood a woman's life was at stake. The ones who weren't cooperative became cooperative when Tiny explained that they could either help now or explain to law enforcement later why they'd obstructed a missing person investigation. The footage from the first gas station showed nothing useful. The second convenience store had cameras pointed the wrong direction. But the third location, a truck stop with cameras covering both the parking lot and the highway entrance, that's where they struck gold. At 8:41 p.m. the previous evening, a black Mercedes SUV with a partial plate visible, 7KJ4. The angle wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough. The vehicle had pulled in, idled for approximately 3 minutes without anyone exiting, then pulled back on a Highway 40 heading east. The bank's ATM camera caught the same vehicle 9 minutes later, same direction. And the fast food restaurant's drive-through camera, positioned to capture license plates for order accuracy, gave them the full plate number, 7KJ428B. Tiny ran the plate through a contact he had in the DMV, someone who owed him a favor and didn't ask too many questions. The registration came back to a shell corporation called Apex Logistics Solutions. No individual owner listed, just a business address in an industrial area on the outskirts of town. They drove there immediately. The industrial district was exactly what you'd expect from a place that time forgot. Blocks of old warehouses, most of them abandoned or barely operational, surrounded by chain-link fencing and overgrown lots. The kind of area where businesses come to die quietly and nobody pays much attention to what happens after dark. The address for Apex Logistics Solutions led them to a warehouse in the middle of the district. From the outside, it looked like every other building on the block, weathered metal siding, cracked concrete, windows so dirty they might as well have been walls. But there were differences if you knew what to look for. The locks on the doors were new, heavy-duty deadbolts that hadn't been there long. The windows weren't just dirty, they'd been deliberately blacked out from the inside. And there were fresh tire tracks in the gravel lot, multiple vehicles coming and going with enough frequency to wear distinct paths in the dirt. Tiny and his team didn't approach. They stayed back, watched, documented. And what they saw over the next 90 minutes confirmed their worst suspicions. 3 different vehicles arrived during that time. One was the black Mercedes SUV. Another was a luxury sedan. The third was a van with no windows in the back. People entered the building. Always men, always well-dressed, but nobody came out. At least not while they were watching. This wasn't an abandoned warehouse. This was an active operation. Tiny called Bull with the location, and within 20 minutes, Bull and the rest of the Brotherhood were converging on the industrial district. They set up surveillance positions around the perimeter, staying far enough back to avoid detection, but close enough to monitor all entry and exit points. Bull made the decision quickly. They were going to surveil the location, gather intelligence, and figure out the best way to get Crystal out safely. But they had to be smart about it. Rushing in blind could get people killed, Crystal included. These weren't amateurs they were dealing with. This was an organized operation with resources and protection. They needed to be patient. They needed to be tactical. But patience was about to become a luxury they couldn't afford. Back at the Sunset Rest stop, a silver sedan pulled into the parking lot. A woman in her early 30s stepped out, carrying a tablet and wearing the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone from Child Protective Services who'd just been handed another impossible case with insufficient resources to handle it properly. Her name was Jennifer Torres, and she'd been doing this job for 6 years, long enough to care deeply, but not long enough to have become completely cynical. She walked into the diner where Vince sat with Natalie, who was now coloring on the back of paper placemats while Ghost and Preacher kept watch. "Mr. Holloway? I'm Jennifer Torres from CPS. I'm here about Natalie Vega." Vince stood, his posture immediately protective. "We're still looking for her mother." Jennifer's face showed sympathy, but also the hard reality of protocol. "I understand that. But I need to take Natalie into protective custody until her mother is located or a suitable guardian is identified." "No." The word came out flat and absolute. Jennifer blinked, clearly not used to outright refusal. "Mr. Holloway, I know you're trying to help, but I promised her we'd find her mom. I'm not breaking that promise." Natalie looked up from her coloring, her eyes moving between Vince and this new stranger, fear creeping back into her face. Jennifer saw it too. She looked at this little girl who'd been through hell in the last 24 hours, then at this leather-clad biker who'd apparently appointed himself her guardian, and something in the rigid structure of policy gave way to human compassion. She pulled out a chair and sat down, lowering her voice. "Tell me what's happening." "All of it." Vince explained everything. The investigation, the leads, the warehouse they'd just located. He showed her the text messages on Crystal's broken phone. He told her about Dalton Reeves and the trafficking operation and the corruption that had allowed it to flourish. Jennifer listened, and as she listened, her professional detachment cracked. She'd seen too many cases where the system moved too slowly, where children fell through cracks that should never have existed. And here was a group of people who'd done more in 8 hours than law enforcement had been willing to do at all. "Until end of day," she finally said. "I'll file my report showing that Natalie is with a responsible adult in a safe location while active efforts are being made to locate her mother. But if Crystal isn't found by tonight, I have to take her. That's the best I can do." Vince nodded. It would have to be enough. While this negotiation was happening, Tiny was pulling up county property records on his phone, trying to figure out who actually owned the warehouse they'd located. What he found made his blood run cold. Apex Logistics Solutions was registered under a shell corporation, which was owned by another shell corporation, which eventually traced back to a name that appeared in the public record for property taxes, Detective Marcus Vaughn, the same officer who'd responded to the motel that morning. The same cop who dismissed Crystal's disappearance as probably just a domestic situation. The same man who'd filed a report and then walked away, leaving a 7-year-old girl to wait for a system that was never going to help her. Tiny immediately called Bull with the information, and when Bull heard the name, he felt that sick, furious confirmation of something he'd already suspected. The rot didn't just go deep. It went all the way to the top. Those cops weren't just lazy. They were complicit. And Detective Marcus Vaughn had been protecting Dalton Reeves's operation, probably for years, probably for money. Bull looked at the warehouse, at the fresh locks and blacked-out windows, and understood with perfect clarity they were on their own. Law enforcement wasn't going to help because law enforcement was part of the problem, which meant the Brotherhood was going to have to handle this themselves. 6 Hell's Angels positioned themselves around the warehouse perimeter like a tactical unit, each man finding cover behind abandoned equipment, derelict vehicles, or the corners of adjacent buildings. They'd been watching for 2 hours now, and in that time, they'd learned the rhythm of the place. 3 men had entered through the main door, all of them carrying themselves with the casual arrogance of people who believe they're untouchable. 2 wore expensive suits. The third was dressed more casually, but moved like security, like muscle. None of them looked like they expected any trouble. Through brief openings when the door swung wide, the bikers caught glimpses of the interior. The warehouse had been converted into something else, partitioned walls, lighting that suggested occupied rooms rather than open storage space. And most importantly, they'd seen women. 2 of them, visible for just seconds as someone moved through an interior doorway. One of the women matched Crystal's description. Dark hair, slight build, wearing what looked like the same clothes from the photo on her driver's license. She was moving slowly, like someone who'd been injured, like someone who'd been hurt, and was trying to keep going through sheer force of will. Bull watched through binoculars from his position behind a rusted shipping container, and every muscle in his body tensed with the desire to crash through that door immediately. But rushing and reckless would get people killed. They needed to be smart. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Not to local police, they knew better now. He called the FBI field office in Las Vegas, asked for the agent in charge of human trafficking investigations, and got connected to a woman named Sandra Reyes. Agent Reyes, my name is Bull McKenzie. I have information about a trafficking operation run by Dalton Reeves. There was a pause on the other end, the kind of silence that comes when someone suddenly sits up straighter and pays full attention. Go on. Bull explained everything. Crystal's disappearance, the warehouse, the shell corporation tied to Detective Vaughn, the victims they believed were being held inside. He laid it out clearly, factually, leaving no room for dismissal. Agent Reyes's voice carried a mixture of frustration and vindication. We've been watching Reeves for months. We know he's running a trafficking network. But every time we get close, evidence disappears, witnesses recant, warrants get blocked. We've suspected local law enforcement was compromised, but couldn't prove it. What if we get you eyes inside? Visual confirmation of victims of the operation? I can't officially condone civilians entering a potentially dangerous situation. Didn't ask you to. Another pause. Then, carefully. If someone were to obtain visual evidence and hold a position until federal agents arrived, and if no one got hurt in the process, that would give us probable cause for immediate action. How fast can you get here? 45 minutes. Maybe less if I push it. Bull gave her the address and hung up. 45 minutes. They could do that. They could create a distraction, get someone inside for visual confirmation, hold position until the cavalry arrived. It was risky, but everything about this situation was risky. He was coordinating the plan with his brothers, assigning roles and positions, when they heard it. Raised voices from inside the warehouse. Shouting. The unmistakable sound of conflict. Bull raised his hand, signaling everyone to freeze and listen. The voices grew louder, more aggressive. A man's voice, cold and controlled but laced with menace. Then a woman's voice, Crystal's voice, defiant despite the fear. You can't keep me here. My daughter knows I'm missing. People are looking. A sharp crack. The sound of a hand striking flesh. Crystal cried out. Nobody's looking for you, sweetheart. Nobody cares. And if you don't cooperate, you're going to find out what happens to girls who cause problems. Remember Natalie's words? If mommy tells, we both disappear. Crystal must have finally told Dalton she was leaving. She'd held on to hope that she could make it to that bus, get her daughter to safety. But Dalton had found out, and now she was paying the price. Bull looked at his watch. 43 minutes until the FBI arrived. But from the sounds coming from inside that warehouse, Crystal didn't have 43 minutes. Time had just run out. Bull made the decision in seconds. He signaled to Razor and Truck, 2 of his most level-headed brothers, and the 3 of them approached the front entrance of the warehouse while the others held position. The plan was simple, almost absurdly so. Pose as potential clients. Keep whoever answered the door occupied long enough for someone to get eyes inside. Bull knocked, 3 solid raps that echoed in the quiet industrial district. The door opened just wide enough for a man to fill the gap. He was built like a bouncer, thick neck, dead eyes, the kind of hired muscle that doesn't ask questions and doesn't care about answers. He looked at the 3 bikers with immediate suspicion. Help you? Bull kept his voice casual, almost friendly. Heard you run a discreet operation. Got cash. Looking for some company tonight. The man's eyes narrowed. Don't know what you're talking about. Sure you don't. Look, we're not cops. We're just passing through. Heard this was the place to find some entertainment. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. We'll move along. The muscle hesitated, calculating. Behind him, another voice called out. Who is it? Some bikers. Asking about services. There was movement inside, footsteps approaching. The door opened wider, and a second man appeared. This one in a suit, trying to project authority and sophistication that didn't quite mask the predator underneath. Gentlemen, I think you have the wrong address. This is a logistics company. Bull smiled, playing the part. Right. Logistics. That's what I said. While this conversation unfolded at the front entrance, Vince and Ghost were circling around to the back of the warehouse, moving low and fast through the shadows. The rear of the building was less maintained, with rusted fire escapes and boarded windows. But there, high up, near the roofline, one window was slightly open, probably for ventilation in a building that hadn't been designed for human occupancy. Vince pointed. Ghost nodded. They moved to the wall directly beneath it. Ghost braced himself, creating a platform with his interlocked hands. Vince stepped into it, and Ghost lifted, boosting him up until Vince could grab the window ledge. His arms strained, 52 years old and climbing warehouse walls, but adrenaline and purpose made him stronger than he had any right to be. He pulled himself up, peered through the gap, and what he saw made his heart stop. Crystal was there, handcuffed to a metal chair in what looked like a converted office space. Her face was bruised, fresh injuries that hadn't been there when she'd left Natalie the night before. She was terrified, tears streaming down her face, but still defiant. Still fighting. Through an interior door that stood partially open, Vince could see into an adjacent room. 3 other women, all in similar conditions. Restrained, frightened, trapped. And then Dalton Reeves walked into view. He was exactly what you'd picture if someone said successful predator. Early 40s, expensive tailored suit, groomed hair, calm demeanor that somehow made him more terrifying than if he'd been overtly violent. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for anything. He had a phone pressed to his ear, and Vince could hear fragments of the conversation. Yeah, moving them tonight. New location. This one's burned. I don't know how, but someone's been asking questions. We need to relocate before it becomes a problem. Vince's stomach dropped. They were about to move Crystal. Tonight. If the bikers didn't act now, she'd disappear into another location, another city, another layer of hell that would make her impossible to find. This is the moment where everything could have gone wrong. These men weren't soldiers. They weren't law enforcement. They were mechanics, construction workers, guys who ride motorcycles on weekends. But sometimes courage isn't about being trained. It's about being unwilling to walk away. Vince made eye contact with Crystal through the window. She saw him, and for a split second, hope flickered across her face before fear took over. Fear that he'd be caught, that this would make things worse. But it was too late for caution now. They were going in. Vince dropped from the window, landing hard on the gravel beside Ghost. His voice was urgent, absolute. They're moving her now. FBI won't make it. We go. Ghost pulled out his phone, sent a 3-word text to Bull. We go now. At the front entrance, Bull's phone buzzed. He read the message, and something shifted in his eyes, that cold calculation that comes before action. He looked at the man in the suit still trying to maintain the fiction that this was a legitimate business, and Bull's pleasant expression disappeared. Do it, he said into his radio. What happened next unfolded with the brutal efficiency of men who'd spent their lives handling situations that required immediate, decisive action. Bull and his team at the front entrance didn't knock again. Razor produced bolt cutters from inside his jacket, and in one powerful motion, cut through the chain on the door. Bull kicked it open, the metal door slamming against the interior wall with a sound like thunder. The element of surprise was total and overwhelming. Dalton's 3 men, the muscle at the door, the suit, and a third enforcer who'd been inside, were used to dealing with terrified victims, not with 6 Hell's Angels pouring through the entrance like an avenging force. One of them went for a gun holstered at his hip. He never cleared leather. Truck was on him in 2 seconds, twisting his arm behind his back with enough force that the weapon clattered to the concrete floor. The man went down hard, face first, with Truck's knee in his spine. The other two tried to run. Bad decision. In a warehouse, there's nowhere to run that isn't a dead end eventually. Bull moved through the space like he owned it, his massive frame filling doorways, his voice booming commands. Everyone on the ground. Now, Dalton Reeves, smooth, sophisticated Dalton Reeves, was trying to escape through a back exit when Bull rounded the corner and blocked his path. For the first time, the calm demeanor cracked. Dalton's face showed something he probably hadn't felt in years, genuine fear. "You're done, Reeves." Dalton tried to speak, tried to summon that commanding presence he used to control everyone around him. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I have connections. You'll regret this." Bull stepped forward, closing the distance until they were inches apart. "The only thing I regret is not finding you sooner." Meanwhile, Vince had entered through the back, moving straight to the room where he'd seen Crystal. She was still handcuffed to the chair, eyes wide with shock and confusion at the chaos erupting around her. Vince knelt beside her, his voice gentle despite the violence happening in the background. "Your daughter sent me. Natalie's safe." Crystal's face crumpled. Every ounce of strength she'd been holding onto for the past 24 hours broke free in a sob that came from somewhere deep and wounded. "Natalie. Oh God, Natalie." "She's safe," Vince repeated, producing a small pry bar from his jacket and working on the handcuffs. The metal gave way, and Crystal's hands were free. She collapsed forward, and Vince caught her, supporting her weight. The other brothers had already moved to the adjacent room, freeing the 3 other women who'd been held captive. Young women, barely in their 20s, who'd been promised legitimate work and found themselves trapped in a nightmare. They were herded outside into the fresh air, into safety, wrapped in jackets that the bikers shrugged off without thinking. The entire operation, from the moment Bull kicked in that door to the moment all 4 women were outside and all 3 of Dalton's men were restrained on the ground, took less than 8 minutes. And then, like divine timing, they heard the sirens. FBI vehicles poured into the industrial district, followed by marked units from County Sheriff and Nevada State Police. Agent Sandra Reyes stepped out of the lead vehicle, surveying the scene with an expression that was equal parts impressed and exasperated. She walked up to Bull, who was standing over Dalton Reeves like a sentinel. All suspects were restrained with zip ties. All victims were accounted for and safe. Evidence was everywhere. The converted rooms, the restraints, the burner phones scattered on tables, the records that Dalton had been too confident to hide properly. It was a perfect, gift-wrapped case. Agent Reyes looked at Bull for a long moment. "This never happened the way you're going to tell it." Bull's face remained neutral. "We just happened to be passing by when we heard screaming. Thought someone might need help." Agent Reyes nodded slowly. "Lucky timing. Very lucky." She turned to her team. "Secure the scene. Get medical for the victims. I want every piece of evidence cataloged and every suspect processed. And someone get Detective Vaughn on the phone. Tell him we need to have a conversation about his business interests. If you believe in justice over bureaucracy, hit that like button. Share the story. Because the system wanted to wait 24 hours. These men didn't. And 4 women went home because of it." The paramedics had checked Crystal at the warehouse, confirmed her injuries were painful but not life-threatening, and cleared her for transport. But she'd refused to go to the hospital. There was only one place she needed to be. Vince drove her back to the Sunset Rest stop in his pickup truck, Bull following behind on his Harley. The sun was setting now, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple, and the motel looked different somehow. Less desolate, less hopeless. Maybe because they were bringing someone home. Jennifer Torres, the CPS worker, had kept Natalie in the diner, coloring and eating ice cream, while Ghost and Preacher stood guard. When she saw Vince's truck pull into the parking lot, she understood immediately. She knelt down beside Natalie and said softly, "Sweetheart, look who's here." Natalie looked up, saw her mother stepping out of the truck, and the world stopped. For a moment, neither of them moved. Crystal stood there, bruised and exhausted and barely holding herself together. Natalie stood frozen, as if afraid that moving might make the vision disappear, might prove this was just another cruel dream. Then Crystal opened her arms, and Natalie ran. She ran the way only a child runs toward their mother after believing they might never see her again, with everything, with complete abandon, with a need that transcended words. She hit Crystal with enough force that they both stumbled, but Crystal caught her, wrapped her arms around her daughter, and held on like she'd never let go. The embrace lasted minutes. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Crystal buried her face in Natalie's hair, breathing in the scent of her daughter, confirming she was real and safe and here. Natalie clung to her mother with a grip that spoke of hours of terror and the overwhelming relief of having that terror finally end. When Crystal finally pulled back enough to look at her daughter's face, tears were streaming down both their cheeks. "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry I left you." "You came back," Natalie whispered. "You came back." Crystal looked over at Vince, who stood a respectful distance away, and her voice broke as she spoke through tears. "You saved our lives." Vince shook his head, his own eyes wet despite his best efforts. "Your daughter saved you. She was brave enough to ask for help." A medical team that had followed from the warehouse approached, gently insisting they needed to examine Crystal properly. She had bruised ribs, facial contusions, defensive wounds on her arms. Nothing that wouldn't heal, but everything that would serve as evidence. Crystal agreed, but kept Natalie's hand in hers the entire time, refusing to let go even for the examination. Jennifer Torres stood off to the side, watching the reunion with tears streaming down her face. When Bull walked past, she said quietly, almost to herself, "This is why I do this job." Bull stopped, nodded. "Good people still exist." "They do," she agreed, looking at the brotherhood of bikers who'd made this possible. "They really do." Bull walked over to where Vince stood, watching mother and daughter with the satisfaction of someone who'd kept a promise that mattered. Bull put a heavy hand on his shoulder. "You did good, brother." Vince shook his head slightly, a small smile on his weathered face. "We all did. And that was the truth of it. Not one man being a hero, but brothers standing together when it mattered most." The news broke 48 hours later, spreading across local and then national media like wildfire. Dalton Reeves, prominent businessman and suspected trafficker, arrested on federal charges. The operation he'd been running for years, finally dismantled. But the story didn't stop there. Detective Marcus Vaughn was arrested as an accomplice. The evidence was overwhelming. Property records, financial transfers, text messages that proved he'd been providing protection and intelligence to Reeves for at least 3 years. Every time someone got close to exposing the operation, Vaughn had been there to redirect investigations, lose evidence, intimidate witnesses. The FBI's raid on the warehouse had opened doors to 7 other locations across Nevada and California. 7 additional victims were identified and rescued. Women who'd been moved through Dalton's network disappeared into a system that treated them as merchandise. Federal charges came down like a hammer: human trafficking, kidnapping, conspiracy, racketeering. Both Reeves and Vaughn faced life sentences. Crystal's testimony became the keystone of the prosecution's case. She could identify other victims, other locations, other men involved in the operation. Which meant she and Natalie needed protection. The federal government placed them in witness protection, new names, new location, a chance to start over somewhere Dalton's remaining associates could never find them. Before they left, Crystal returned to the Sunset Rest Stop one final time. The brotherhood stood together in the parking lot as Crystal approached, Natalie holding her hand. She walked directly to Vince and handed him an envelope. "I don't have words for what you did," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion. "But Natalie wanted you to have this." Vince opened the envelope and pulled out a drawing done in crayon on paper that had been carefully folded. It showed a little girl holding hands with a figure wearing a leather jacket. Above the figure, Natalie had drawn wings. An angel in leather. Crystal and Natalie left that afternoon, escorted by federal agents to a new life that these bikers would never know the details of. And that was how it should be. Sometimes the best outcome is becoming a memory, a good memory, for someone who deserves to forget the nightmare. 3 months later, Bull received a letter at the chapter clubhouse. It wasn't from Crystal. It was from 6 women they'd never met, never heard of, never knew existed. Each one had been in Dalton's pipeline, scheduled to arrive at that warehouse the week after the rescue. When the entire network collapsed, they'd been freed before they ever reached the nightmare that had been waiting for them. The letter ended with 8 words that Bull read 3 times before folding it carefully and putting it in his wallet, where he'd carry it for the rest of his life. "You saved us without even knowing we existed." If this story moved you, here's what you can do. Subscribe to see more stories that don't get told. Share this with someone who needs to remember that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. And comment with one word: brotherhood. Let's show that community still means something.